14 mental traps that control our lives without us paying attention. Many times, without even realizing it, we fall into the traps set by our own conscience, which often makes us make bad decisions. Some have no consequences, but others can make us have a very bad time. In this article, we are going to talk to you about this kind of pitfalls to avoid. 14. Two-speed judgment. Very often, we justify the behavior of others by the difficulties and problems they have in their lives, while with ourselves, we are much less lenient and we always feel responsible for the bad things that happen to us. Mistakes like this can lead us to think that we all have the same kind of life, and therefore, we often judge others in a subjective way. 13. To fight to win. Scientists Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber presented a theory that people learn to argue and shout for influence over others. Modern society always depends on this phenomenon, so people cannot help but keep up the tone when they have a conversation, especially, when they have no more arguments. In ancient times, losing in a verbal conflict meant reducing one's chances of survival, so we tend to keep arguing until one of the two sides gives in. 12. Compare the incomparable. We often compare things that are simply incomparable, so that the cause and effect relationship breaks down. For example, we tend to think that the bigger a dog is, the more he is mean. But you will agree that the size of a dog does not affect in any way its character or behavior, is it? 11. Do not trust only his. Since ancient times, consciously or unintentionally, we divide people into groups, and we automatically have more confidence in those who are part of our group, for example our colleagues or our friends. Conversely, we often treat people outside our group with more caution or mistrust. This phenomenon is referred to as in-group favoritism, which means that people overestimate the value of their group and the reliability of its members to the detriment of people they do not know well. 10. Excessive generalization. If you think that everything that happened once will automatically happen again on other occasions, then you have fallen into the trap. If a mechanic has scammed you once, that does not mean that all mechanics will necessarily try to get you. 9. The majority is necessarily right. People tend to believe in something if the majority believes in it. This is where the accepted rules of behavior come from, which are then considered norms in a group. The influence of a group on a person tends to bias reality and free thought, which is why it is important to always have a critical view of statistics. It is not because others are more numerous that they are necessarily right. 8. We remember especially the best of ourselves. We operate in such a way that we often remember only our greatest successes, or we tend to think of ourselves as the best in our field, without even realizing it. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate, said in an interview, "It's amazing how people rarely change their minds, and even when they do not even notice." By changing their point of view, most people are actually adjusting their old way of thinking, convincing themselves that they have always thought that way. 7. The brain believes that in the future we will be a completely different person. According to some studies, when we imagine ourselves in the future, the same parts of the brain that we use to think of other people are activated. In other words, if you are led to imagine how you will be in many years, you unconsciously imagine a stranger who does not have much to do with you. 6. Peltzman effect. According to this theory, the existence of different protective equipment and safety rules makes that a person can sometimes tend to feel invulnerable, which increases the risk of accident. For example, when a rider removes his helmet, he will drive much more carefully than when he feels protected by it. 5. The trap of optimism. This trap is very common among people addicted to the game. They are convinced that after a series of defeats, luck will necessarily smile, and the next hand or part will surely be the right one. The concept of luck that turns works the same way. 4. These sentences rhyme. When people see slogans that rhyme, they retain them better and perceive them as more real. Phrases constructed in the same way, rhyming or repetitive, have the same effect, becoming deeper in our minds. That's why many companies often use this method to make their products and services more easily recognizable, and their ads memorable. 3. There is more and more bad news. People often pay more attention to bad news, but that does not mean that the world is getting worse. Scientists believe that we subconsciously perceive that bad news is of greater importance. Moreover, this kind of information generates strangely more confidence, because the good news finally seems too suspicious or not that interesting. 2. IKEA effect. The most hideous gloves our mother has ever knitted will always make us smile fondly, even though we would not even look at them in stores. This is a good example of how the IKEA effect manifests itself in our lives. On the same principle, we place much more value on the things with which we or our relatives have relationships. 1. The trap of superiority over others. During an experiment, different drivers were asked to compare their driving skills with those of other drivers. Virtually all participants in this experiment sincerely believed that their abilities were above average. In most cases, people have a high opinion of themselves and their skills. This exaggeration proves that it is difficult to self-evaluate objectively. How to avoid falling into these traps? Try to remove from your mind the influence of stereotypes, and never confuse your own feelings and thoughts with what society forces you to believe or want. Always think for yourself, and make your own experience. What do you think of this article? Leave a message in the comments, and do not hesitate to share it with the people around you.